India has lodged a diplomatic objection with China over a new map which lays claim to Indian territory. The so-called 2023 Standard Map of China was published earlier in the week. Now, this new demarcation on the map includes Aksai Chin in the west and the state of Arunachal Pradesh in the eastern part of the border between India and China. Aksai Chin is controlled by China but claimed by India, and Arunachal Pradesh is a state of India that China claims as part of Tibet. India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar rejected China's claims, saying they only complicate the boundary disputes between the two regional powers. In a television interview this week, he said, and I quote, "This is an old habit of Beijing's and not something new. Making absurd claims does not make other people's territories yours." And the message from Beijing: Delhi is overreacting and there's nothing to worry about.
The release of the standard map is routine practice in accordance with China's exercise of sovereignty. We hope that relevant parties will view this matter objectively and calmly and avoid over-interpretation.
And joining me for more on this is DW Delhi Studio Bureau Chief Amrita Chima. Amrita, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has called the Chinese claims in the new map absurd. Does that give an indication of how seriously India takes this new map?
Well, you know, Biresh, the foreign minister might be sounding casual and dismissive about the way he talked about these Chinese claims, but India is certainly not taking this so-called standard map lightly. There's a lot at stake between India and China, huge chunks of territory. For example, Aksai Chin, which India claims historically, but China grabbed this territory in the 1962 war. And then there's this huge state in northeast India, what India calls Arunachal Pradesh, and claims as its own, but China believes it belongs to China and it calls it South Tibet. So huge amounts of territory involved. And also one has to keep in mind that there's another reason why India is worried. New satellite images have come out which seem to indicate that there is military activity taking place in Aksai Chin. There are tunnels being bored in the hillside, there are bunkers being constructed and shelter. This, of course, worries India, and it's lodged a strong protest through diplomatic channels to China.
And this map has also been released just days after the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, where Chinese President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi met briefly, and also a week ahead of the G20 summit in Delhi, where Chinese and Indian delegations will be meeting again. Is China setting the tone for this meeting?
You know, the timing, Biresh, is extremely important. It's no coincidence that this so-called standard map was released just after the BRICS summit and just before the G20 summit. Nothing in China happens by coincidence. These moves, people always believe, are carefully calibrated to send a message. Now, at the BRICS summit, there was much made about this conversation that Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi had. But it was a very short and informal conversation that they had in the leaders' lounge, where they both talked about de-escalation, but it wasn't a big meeting that it was made out to be. So there are also analysts after this BRICS meeting who talked about India must be on the guard so that China does not use the BRICS as a leverage, as a political instrument. With the expansion of the group next year, 6 more countries are joining the BRICS group. And another point, talking about this G20 summit. Now, we know that it was always said that Xi Jinping is coming for this summit, but there was no official announcement. And now we are hearing reports he might skip the meeting altogether. Now, whatever it is, whether he comes or not, many see this as an act of political brinkmanship. Because for India, having China on board for a final communique is extremely important. And therefore, China may hold India hostage on this issue.
And for the past 3 years, Indian and Chinese troops have also been locked in a face-off at the disputed Himalayan border. Any indication on when this will be resolved?
Well, it's when this will be resolved. Of course, the encounter which took place in May 2020 left a very bitter legacy, especially the hand-to-hand combat that took place in Galwan, where at least 20 Indian soldiers were killed. And China never confessed to how many people were really killed on its side, but it's just said 4 were killed, but people think there were many more. Now, this left a very bitter legacy, but despite that, the two countries have decided to continue talking. There have been high-level military talks going on. And the last one was just this month, the 19th Corps Commander meeting. There was no breakthrough, but the two sides described their meeting as constructive, positive and in-depth, and said that they must work to bring peace and tranquility along their border. So I think no one expects this dispute to be resolved quickly, but definitely the two sides have agreed to keep the channels of communication open.
And where does that leave bilateral relations between India and China then?
Well, Biresh, bilateral relations between the two countries have always been prickly, and they remain prickly. Now, the two countries are neighbors, they are rivals, they are competitors, and they fought wars against each other. India has always felt the West hasn't taken its concerns about China seriously enough. But now there's a big new geopolitical churn taking place, and Western countries are keen to reduce their dependence on China and its supply chains. This leaves India in a fairly good spot. It thinks that maybe with this new pivot of the world towards India will give it more leverage in its relations, especially with China.
We'll leave it there for the time being. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Amrita Chima in Delhi. Thank you so much.